Wow, that was really nice. You know, they say wisdom's the better part of valor, and I always think managing expectations is the better part of wisdom. So I think we've already failed, but anyway, thanks. Thank you very much. I really want to welcome you as the acting co-director of the CFI. Um, Thank you for participating in this day. Thank you for being here. It's really good to see all of you. I also want to thank Paul Brink, my acting co-director, who's done a lot of work to put this day together. And especially a thank you to Hannah Craig. Hannah, where are you? I've lost you. Oh, there you are, right there. The room is weighted this way. It's just sort of bending that direction. But Hannah, nothing happens without Hannah. I think many of you really know that. So anyway, thanks very much for putting the symposium day together. And finally, just thanks to all who've contributed to this day through your different projects and presentations. That really has been a gift to the campus, so thank you very much. This afternoon's lectures, it's the last lecture of the day, but in some sense, our symposium is going to be extended a bit because next Tuesday, right here at the same time, Rebecca DeYoung, a professor from Calvin College, a philosophy professor, will be presenting on the topic of anger. And she's written some really wonderful books that I commend to you, Glittering Vices, and also a book called Vain Glory. And she's an engaging speaker and professor and writer. So I really hope that you'll mark that on your calendar, be here next week. It really is an extension of this whole conversation about a life well lived. So that will be, I think, really fruitful. With that, I'm going to invite you to join me in prayer. As Chad mentioned, I teach honor and virtue. And we always begin class usually with an ancient prayer, which really directs our thoughts often to the topic at hand. So pray with me this prayer of St. Augustine as we get ready to begin. Look upon us, O Lord. Let all the darkness of our souls vanish before the beams of your brightness. Fill us with holy love and open to us the treasures of your wisdom. All our desire is known to you. Social bonds strain, fabric frayed. That's a bleak picture. Um, I've noticed there's a lot of anger and a lot of fear and a lot of grief and loss. So what do we do now? I think that's a question we're asking, and I hope that maybe we can make a start and add a little something to the conversation this afternoon about what we do now. The questions are complicated, the answers are multi-layered, but we'll at least try to begin. What I propose to do this afternoon is to look at the long tradition of the virtues and ask what might virtue have for us in a time like this? What can it offer us that could help undergird our faith, give us strength, enable our ability to stand, and maybe even flourish in a really challenging time? Perhaps it can be a source of irrigation for our dry and thirsty souls, this virtue tradition that we're going to talk about. So here's a roadmap for our time together, which is not long, and hopefully it won't seem longer than it really is. But here's the roadmap. First, we're going to mine the virtue. If we're going to mine the virtue tradition, we need to take a little bit of a brief history of ideas, specifically an overview of what exactly is the virtue tradition. If you're a Protestant and not educated in a classical school, this tradition may be a bit of a mystery. It's not something that I know for myself. Being educated and growing up, it was not something I was familiar with at all. So we want to trace its course and follow the development of that tradition. Then we want to look at what within the virtue tradition constitutes a well-lived life. And then finally, we want to ask, what are some of the key virtues that could help us build that life? So those three stops along the way. What is the history of the virtue tradition? And we'll just take a quick look at that. And then what in the virtue tradition constitutes a well-lived life? And then what are some key virtues that will help us build that life? So let's jump into that. The virtues are often thought of specifically as virtue ethics, one of the three major themes in ethical thought, along with deontological ethics, consequentialism. Those emphasize the rule of law and duty, and also best outcomes for the most people. Those are a bit reductionistic, of course. That was just 30 seconds, but you know, that's sort of the 30,000-foot view. You can see that. But I've chosen to talk today about virtues not in terms of ethics, not as virtue ethics, but in terms of the virtue tradition. And there's a specific reason for that. It's because we're going to expand our concern beyond just ethical questions and ask larger questions. The questions that really the virtue tradition excels in answering, and that is, what does it mean to be human? You know, what is good? What is the highest good? What is true happiness, and how do we get it? What does it mean to truly flourish? The virtue tradition focuses its attention on such questions as these, while also giving us insight into the kind of persons we ought to be, and the ways we might actually become what we ought to be. Now, when we talk about the virtue tradition, we're talking about an ancient philosophical tradition. It originates in Plato and Aristotle. It dominated the classical period of ancient Greece, as well as the period of the early church. Augustine was in dialogue with it. And the tradition was most fully synthesized with Christianity by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century in his magisterial work, Summa Theologica. Some of you may be familiar with that. Virtue tradition characterized the philosophical language, at least until the Enlightenment. But things seem to start to shift significantly after that with the rise of Nietzsche, as well as other philosophers, many others, and the tradition receded. And with it, there was a kind of, I would call it a dislodging of the account of what it means to be human from any sense of natural law and of a common understanding of what it means to be good. As Lewis proposed in his very important and prescient book, Abolition of Man, human beings were being reduced to either a pure intellect or pure animal instinct impulse, and in his view, with disastrous results. If you haven't read that book, I really strongly urge you to do so. It's not an easy book to read. It's an important book to read. It's not very long, and I think it opens up a world of ideas that are really important to us, a critique that actually, in my view, is maybe even more relevant than it was when he wrote it, which is not easy to do. In the book, he asks, where's virtue? Where's honor? Where is the thing that truly animates us as human beings? If we're all pure intellect or raw impulse, what will call us up to the higher things? What will inspire a person to lay down his life for his friend? Those were the questions that I think probably kept Lewis up at night. Of course, this is it was a particularly interesting, important question when Lewis gave the lectures that comprise Abolition of Man, because the world was living through the Nazi horror. It was living through the Second World War in about 3 decades. The prevailing moral frameworks were failing miserably. It was all nihilism all the time. The same, I would suggest, dark and grim philosophy that pervades our world even now. And its outcomes were proving to be monstrous, truly, truly monstrous. So there were others, like Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch, all philosophers at Oxford, who tried to reinvigorate the virtue tradition in the philosophy department and in ethics. And they were addressing these sorts of things that virtue concerns itself with. What's the place of moral character? How is it formed? What is moral wisdom? What kind of people should we be? What's the place of family and friendship? What is a deep concept of happiness? What role do emotions play in our moral life? An important one. These philosophers in the virtue tradition diverged from these really highly theoretical, abstract conversations to ask what they took to be the central question, how should we live? Their work was significant, and it now is viewed as foundational for and a signpost toward what would become a later resurgence, but at the time it really languished. It wasn't until Alistair MacIntyre wrote his classic book, After Virtue, which was a classic critique of life without the virtue tradition. And it became the book most responsible for virtue's revival. And this was really in the 80s that virtue started to make a comeback, at least in philosophical thought and in social thought. So you had commentators then like Christopher Lasch, Philip Rieff, Robert Bellah, all talking about the necessity of virtue as they tried to assess society and found really a collective psyche loaded with anxiety and loneliness, depression, narcissism, all of these things reflective of the bankruptcy, really, of our moral frameworks. And so they argued that we needed more grounding in truth, that we needed a more robust account of the good life, that we needed more meaning, and a firmer grasp of the transcendent. And so philosophy and psychology and theology, they renewed their search for an account of meaning, of virtue and human flourishing. And that's what we've seen over the last 40 years is an incredible resurgence of attention to these topics. Philosophers like Candace Vogler at the University of Chicago and Jennifer Frey in South Carolina got $2.5 million from the Templeton Foundation. And what were they studying? Virtue, happiness, and the meaning of life. This was the focus of their work. We have the positive psychology movement, which shouldn't be misunderstood as a positive thinking movement. It's asking questions about human beings, about what, rather than dealing with pathology, the question is, what helps human beings thrive? And so they're shifting from the idea of mental illness, not to insist that it's unimportant, but to say, what makes a human being resilient? What makes a human being thrive? That's the positive psychology movement. And so it's Martin Seligman who's been a leader in that amongst many others. They really reoriented psychological research towards the questions about conditions necessary for that. And Templeton has funded a lot of that too, particularly in the area of gratitude, but other areas as well. And then the theology of virtue, which has always been a strength in Catholic theology, but it's this finding Protestant voices. And so there's an integration happening of moral theology and as well as spiritual formation. So that's sort of the history of the virtue tradition, the lightning round from Aristotle to present. And it gives you just an idea of where we come and what the road has been that's been traversed. So with that as a backdrop, let's attempt to mine the virtue tradition in the short time that we have this afternoon. And we're going to try to do that by asking just two questions. Well, one question and some clauses, and then the second question. What does the virtue tradition tell us about our most basic human aim, our telos, our purpose? What are we driving at? In its most pithy form, we might ask, as J.K.A. Smith asked in his book, You Are What You Love, what do you want? What do you want? That's the first question. And the second question we'll ask is, what does the virtue tradition tell us about how to get what we want? So those are our two questions that we're going to try to answer. So let's take the first question. What do we want? Now, this might appear at first glance to be an incredibly modern question. And it might tend to evoke in us a concern about modern narcissism and think it's an ill-considered place to begin. But it should reassure us to remember that this is the first question Jesus asked his disciples. When you look in the first chapter of John, he turns to them and says, what do you seek? What do you seek? So maybe this is a good starting point after all. And throughout all of the ages, throughout all that history that we just talked about, there really is a resounding answer, and that answer is happiness. Now, it's a hard assertion to dispute. We all want to be happy. Peter Kreeft, who's a well-known philosopher at Boston College, says it's often said, that money can't buy happiness. Most people would say that, but nobody says you shouldn't want happiness. Nobody ever critiques the phrase from that point of view. So happiness is the common answer to our question. The writer of Psalm affirms happiness as the chief outcome of the love of God's law. Happy is the man, right? Happy is the man who does not stand in the path of sinners, but delights in the law of the Lord. And Jesus places it at the center of his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, known as the Beatitudes. Augustine said our soul can't find its rest till it finds its rest in God, and surely implicit in that is the assertion that God is the true source of happiness. Augustine doesn't argue against the pursuit of happiness, but suggests it must be ordered, directed towards its proper object and proper end. The Westminster Catechism should be invoked here as well. For to glorify God and enjoy him forever is to illuminate both the goal of happiness and its path. So from there we look to the modern studies done at the Institutes of Studies of Human Flourishing at the University of Oklahoma, or Martin Seligman, the founder of positive psychology. Happiness is what we want. Now, some of you may think that the pursuit of happiness in our current context is a source of lots of trouble, and you might be right. And the source of hedonism, selfishness, instability, immorality. Apologize for my voice this afternoon, it's a little bit rough. How do we reconcile this perspective with seeming philosophical, theological, psychological consensus? The answer, as is often the case, is in the definition of the word itself. Our word, happiness, is very distinct from the ancient meaning of happiness, and this helps us sort things out. Our word, happiness, comes from the root hap. What other words come from the word hap? Happens, haphazard, perhaps. All words of luck, of maybe good fortune. When we say, I'm happy, we generally mean we feel pleasant, we feel content, we feel like something good has happened to us. By this definition, To take an extreme case, the person under the influence of opioids could be said to be happy, even though this state of pleasure is fleeting and the constant pursuit of it will eventually destroy every scintilla of a person's life. It will burn it down. But nevertheless, our common definition of happiness would apply to that sense of fleeting pleasure that the addict experiences. Now, the word for happy in the virtue tradition is the Greek word eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. And the distinctions are in the word itself, just like in the word for our word for happiness. Eudaimonia, which is translated happiness, really can be broken down like this. EU, good, like eulogy and Eucharist, goodness. And then daimon, which is spirit in us. And the ending, ia, which carries a meaning of substantive, permanent, stable. So eudaimonic happiness is a different kind of happiness than the happiness we often seek. It has qualities that bring stability to a person. It's tied deeply to the good. It connects to our core, to the inner life and well-being of a person, and rather than a temporary state, it's persistent and it's stable. This definition makes the happiness of eudaimonia a distinctly different thing from the happiness of our modern usage. In the virtue tradition, eudaimonia is best understood by the very conceptually thick term human flourishing. It is not a fleeting pleasure, but it is a full, rich, and deep flourishing. The everyday definition of this seems rather clear, though philosophers argue about it, as philosophers are wont to do. But look outside. It's spring. Everything is flourishing. When we look around, we see what flourishing is. Flourishing means truly alive and functioning according to the kinds of things they are, right? So when we look outside, what do we expect to see when we see a flourishing tree? We don't expect to see baby trees chasing each other around. And when we look at little animals, we don't expect them to be blossoming. No, trees blossom. That's flourishing according to the kind of thing they are. And the baby rabbits, at least in my yard, chase each other incessantly all spring long, begging one another to do more, like toddlers, more and more. Burgeoning life according to its kind. Birds build their nests. Male and female are procreating everywhere you look. The natural world around us is flourishing. I know there are challenges in the world. If Dorothy was here, she was here a little bit. She would talk to us about that. But really, on the face of it, when we look around, we see a very clear definition of what it means to flourish. And that's the kind of thing we're interested in today. So what does a human being look like when they flourish? How do we live our lives well? If flourishing is a holistic term and it encompasses all the dimensions of a person, then what will it look like as it relates to our will? What are flourishing thoughts? What are flourishing emotions? What's a flourishing body? What are flourishing relationships? We're fully flourishing when all parts of ourselves are rightly ordered to the good. That's what flourishing is. When we are functioning according to the kinds of things we really are. And in this definition, one can be objectively happy or flourishing, even while experiencing difficulties, sorrows, hardships, or suffering. In our modern definition of happiness, happiness is purely subjective. It's purely subjective. But in a eudaimonic sense of happiness, we can say, I am happy, even when we're under enormous pressures, even when we're coming out of a pandemic, even when we're suffering from painful losses. Because what we mean is in all of the essential ways, my person is still ordered to the good. Well, we said that that order has to happen according to the kind of thing we are. And so the question is then, what kinds of things is a human being? What kind of being is a human being? And the answer will tell us in what human happiness, human flourishing, is to be found. In what does it consist? The ancients derived their answers from careful observation and contemplation of their subjects. That's how philosophy worked. We take our answers from theological commitments, but if it's done well, the two should find a convergence, right? All truth, God's truth. And so we should find a convergence of those two things, and I think we do. In the Christian understanding, a human being is, first of all, created. And whatever you may think about the mechanism of origins, to be a Christian is to believe that human beings stand as creatures. It is to believe that we stand in relation to a creator, and that as such we are ordered by and beholding to an objective reality outside of ourselves. Secondly, human beings are elevated. We are distinct from the rest of creation in that we are made in the image of God. I mean, this is a mysterious concept, but one that clearly warrants a kind of seriousness when considering the value and worth of human beings. And thirdly, based on these first two things, human beings are related to God and to each other and to all dimensions of ourselves in an ontological way. And what I mean by that is an indivisible way, in that we aren't human if we're not related. I want to say it just a little bit differently, because of course we remain human and we remain in the image of God. But we can't flourish according to what we are as human beings unless we are related in those ways to God and to one another and to ourselves. We're not divisible. And the history of studies in psychology affirm this over and over again. Without attachment to another human being, babies fail to thrive. Solitary confinement, one of the most cruel and unusual punishments a person can be victimized by. So relationship becomes essential to who we are as human beings. We're not meant to be isolated, to be fragmented or alienated, but connected and integrated and unified. So these three characteristics, created, elevated, related, they give us a map to flourishing as a human being. To fully flourish, we have to know our Creator, accept our place. We are not the masters of the universe. We are recipients of God's gifts. The gift of a body, the gift of responsibilities of stewardship, the gift of unique human capacities. It also means reality is objective. It's not something we can manipulate or distort. Human flourishing is understood to require reality. Mental, emotional, relational dysfunction almost always have elements of, proceed from, or result in some distortions of reality. We can talk about this more in the question and answer time, but it's an interesting thing to note. To fully flourish as a human being, we have to comprehend our own and others' true value and worth. This is also essential. And finally, to fully flourish as human beings, we must be fully related to God in a covenant of grace, in communities of love, obligation. We're not meant to be a community at odds with one another or continually at odds within ourselves, within our own thoughts and feelings, perspectives, and bodies. We're meant to be in a harmony. This is what describes wholeness, that is a human flourishing. an objective state that brings meaning, satisfaction, the capacity to transcend circumstances, because our relationship is with enduring realities. Our modern definition of happiness is not this. Not robust, not enduring. It leaves us in these hard times lost and wondering. But true happiness, eudaimonia, it is robust enough to persist when we must confront what Aeneas calls the tears of things. An apt description, I think, for our current moment. So having described what a flourishing human is, we're led to the next obvious question: how do we cultivate this flourishing? How do we get it? How do we feel filled up? It's a big ask, and it's not meant to discourage us, but it's meant to draw us in desire and expectation towards something greater and something more. Now, there are many roads traveled in this quest to human flourishing, and I do want to talk just briefly about two common roads in our current culture, and then turn to the path of virtue. The first path, commonly taken in an effort to flourish, is often called authenticity in our current time. By saying it's in our culture right now, I'm not suggesting that it hasn't been around for a long time, the subject of philosophers' musings, but it's really come to the forefront in recent decades and has become what I would call radical, by which I just simply mean the project of authenticity has become almost entirely self-referential. And the same could be said of a second path, which we often call freedom. Both of these live largely in the world around us right now, and with overall a deeper disregard for the kind of things human beings really are. And naming human beings as created and elevated and related, we're in one stroke laying an axe to this thoroughly sort of self-constructed, hyper-individualized definitions of authenticity and freedom. Both concepts are, or at least they can be, rich and meaningful, but only from within the sphere of reality established by creation. When authenticity and freedom become radically self-referential, without reference or connection to the objective world and the objective acts of a creator, they become profoundly destructive. We've already said that mental health is impacted in significant ways by one's relationship to reality. But to order and direct one's life toward nothing and no one but one's own impulses, perceptions, and even concepts of the good, that is a fatal detour. It's a fatal detour. Expressive individualism, as some have called it, has undercut the honorable, rich concepts of authenticity and freedom and reduced them to a kind of pathology that ultimately threatens flourishing. There's a movie I want us to consider just for a minute as kind of an illustration of this. It's the movie Gravity. It was a 2013 Academy Award-winning movie. It starred Sandra Bullock and George Clooney, blasts from the past. In a key scene in the movie, Bullock and Clooney have to take a spacewalk to try and salvage their damaged spaceship. And predictably, they both become imperiled because of some broken safety equipment. That's a paradox, right? The broken safety equipment. And so to save Bullock, Clooney breaks away from his tether, and in what you can imagine is a really dramatic moment. She's tied to the ship. He's tied to her. The rope is about to break. And so he releases it and drifts off into space. Now, Clooney's character makes this decision in order to save the life of his colleague. So it's a courageous act because it's a self-giving act. No problem there. But the point I want us to see here is the paradox of freedom. In being cast out into space, he's free, unbound by anything, radical freedom. But ultimately, he's helpless and hopeless. Why? because the environment's not made for the needs of the human body. No oxygen, no gravity. And he drifts off alone into nothingness. I mean, the scene almost gave me a panic attack, just watching him drift off into a complete, not emptiness, but in terms of an environment for a human, complete emptiness, nothing there for him. And the radical freedom that was offered by this absence of gravity was in the end not freedom at all, but a death sentence. His freedom actually rendered him powerless, absolutely powerless. Could not direct his life, couldn't make any change in what was happening to him. His freedom was going to be his death. What a paradox. What a paradox. In a self-created world without gravity, proponents of this definition of the good as radical and as self-referential authenticity and freedom have no tethering. So thus no true choice, no freedom of movement, no power to act. To borrow a phrase from Walker Percy, lost in the cosmos. So what is needed for flourishing is moral gravity. It's objective reality, a natural law that tethers, or perhaps we could say boundaries, human action, decisions, love, and choice, which defines the good and provides us with the conditions, the power necessary for action. What is needed is virtue. The moral excellences which produce the kind of environment that, unlike space, is perfectly fitted for the kind of life that humans are made for. Joseph Pieper is a 20th century interpreter of Aquinas, and in his little book, A Brief Reader on the Virtues of the Human Heart, Pieper says this: reality is the basis of ethics, goodness is the standard of reality, and whoever wants to know and do the good must direct his gaze toward the objective world of being, not toward his own sentiment or toward arbitrarily established ideals and models. He must look away from his own deed and look upon reality. So what are the virtues? The virtues derived from this reality, the reality of what humans need to flourish. What are their qualities generally, and then what are their names, and what are their characteristics? Why do we count them as virtues? Well, let's just first try to define what a virtue is. Sometimes it just feels like a moral target, but it's not that. And so let's try to tease it apart. A virtue is an excellence. It's a moral excellence. And it becomes a virtue when it's found in a person as a stable disposition, which is exercised with a kind of ease. And Aquinas might say, a sweet delight. What kind of things do we do with a sweet delight? Things that come naturally to us. It is said to be characteristic, a second nature. And when virtue is fully formed, it orders all parts of the person. So it orders our intentions, it orders our thoughts, our emotions. It orders the action of the body towards its good end. You know, virtue puts the whole person in service to the good in very specific ways. And we're going to look at those ways in a minute. And in this way, it might be called a habit of the heart. That's what a virtue is. Secondly, and as I just said, this is extremely important, that virtues are not moral targets. They're not a new law. Or they're not simply a different way to speak about rules. We need to be sure to avoid that. Virtues as qualities of character are better thought of as powers. They're better thought of as powers. Just like gravity in a strange way gives us power to move and to direct our actions, virtue also is power, gives us the capacity to move and direct our actions in certain ways. So in cultivating virtue, we're cultivating the powers necessary to do good, all right? To live well, to be well, as Aristotle said. To be all that God has intended us to be as human beings, made in his image. Now, in the Christian tradition, particularly in the medieval depictions of the virtues, we often find the image of a tree with a deep root, and then the trunk that comes out with the strong limbs and then branches that follow out from that. The image serves as a whole scheme, really, of virtue development. And there's a virtue at the root, and from this root springs the trunk, and then all other branches spring from that. And so it's from the root that the branches draw nourishment and growth. The root of the tree in Christian thought is humility. Humility is the root from which all other things spring. And this is in its essence our submission to God, not thinking lowly of ourselves, but submitting to who we are as creatures. And we began our quest for virtue by understanding we are defined by the story of which we are a part. It is God's story. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, says Solomon. So our journey begins with this fundamental stance of humility. Without it, true virtue remains elusive. And then next on this tree are the main branches, which are often referred to as the cardinal virtues. They are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control. Let me say those again. They are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control. Why cardinal? Because cardinal is the Latin word for hinge. It means everything else turns on these virtues, and all other virtues spring forth from them. It doesn't make them the most important, but it does make them central to our development of virtue. Let me just talk a little bit about how we define these virtues. The first cardinal virtue is practical wisdom. This is distinct from capital W wisdom. What we mean by all-wise God, that's capital W wisdom. Practical wisdom speaks to our capacity to think and act in the daily demands of life. Aquinas said the following: the Christian who is prudent, or as we're calling it, practically wise, does not allow his view on reality to be controlled by the yes or no of his will, but rather he makes this yes or no of the will dependent on the truth of real things. Let me give you an example of this. It helps, I think, illustrate what practical wisdom is. Say we want to do something good. We want to throw our best friend a birthday party, and we decide we're going to have a huge party. We want it to be really special. But because we're not willing to look at reality, we overlook the fact that we only have $1.25 in our bank account. And then because we're not looking carefully at reality, but we're really driven by our own excitement about this party, we forget that our friend is desperately introverted, hates to be the subject of attention, and doesn't want to spend the evening with a group of 40 people. And then we remember, too late, because we weren't paying attention, that we have a commitment the next day, and that the energy and time that's going to be required to prepare for that commitment is going to be undermined by the party that we decided to throw, the ill-advised party that we planned without taking time to assess reality. What happens? Well, the thing we wanted to be good was a good idea, but our friend ends up sad, mad, worn out. Our guests are disappointed because their effort to be present wasn't appreciated. And whatever happened the next day is a disaster because we were too tired to think through carefully what it was that we needed to do. Good idea, bad execution. Or as in practical wisdom, we would say, right thing, wrong time, wrong way. Practical wisdom means doing the right thing in the right way at the right time. And so that's what we mean by practical wisdom. The second cardinal virtue is justice. And classically, justice is defined by giving someone their due. And in the Christian account, this would be, at the core, their due as a human being made in the image of God. It incorporates the principles of valuing fairness and impartiality. The virtue of justice is the moral excellence we cultivate that enables us to live well with others and to elevate their concerns equal to ours. Justice takes all of the gifts, all the excellences that we have, and puts them into service of others. This is at the very heart of the character of God. I mean, think about it. He has put all of his excellence at our disposal. He's put all of it into service to us. And that's what justice is. And because of that love of justice is a uniquely animating power. The third cardinal virtue is courage, or the broader term, fortitude. And this is sometimes thought to mean a lack of fear, but Pieper's quick to point out that fortitude actually presumes vulnerability. Without vulnerability, there would be no fortitude. So rather than lack of fear, fortitude is by definition the willingness to receive a wound. We should add also for the sake of the good, a willingness to sustain a wound for the sake of the good. And finally, the fourth cardinal virtue is temperance, or self-control. Temperance speaks to our relationship with desire and pleasure. And we often think of this in terms of things like food or drink or other bodily pleasures. But the concern really is much broader. The idea of self-control touches all parts of ourselves. Think about control over our emotions, over our tongues. Think about the control that keeps my hand, or might have kept Will Smith's hand from hitting Chris Rock. These are all the kinds of control that temperance speaks to. Can I control and direct my eyes? It's capacity to direct our actions according to reason and not according to impulse, right? And by that I mean consistent with our intentions and our understanding of the good. So we can sum it up like this: the virtues are the building blocks of a well-lived life. They are the powers that cultivate flourishing, and thus the powers that nourish our true, deep, lasting happiness. In practical wisdom, we have the power to see. In justice, we have the power that's at the heart of God. In courage, we have the power to act. And in temperance, we have the power to restrain. I mean, that is a lot of power. That is a lot of power. And it has the potential to bring us a lot of flourishing. So as we come to the end of our time, I just want to spend the last bit that we have talking about how do we cultivate these virtues. The metaphor of cultivation is really fitting. It's a metaphor especially apt in a conversation about flourishing. It's organic, right? And what we find is that the virtues feed and nurture and multiply one another. So what do we have to do? We have to create the right conditions for growth. And this is how we cultivate the cardinal virtues and all the other virtues that follow, by the way. And there are many. You heard about some of them today: forgiveness, but there's also gratitude, compassion, all kinds of fruits of the Spirit, really, that are virtues. And so it's just that out of the cardinal virtues, these other virtues come also to flourish. And without the cardinal virtues, it's difficult to nurture a broader understanding of what they are. So first, in order to grow in the virtues, we have to want them. We have to want them, and we have to love them. We have to want and love. Pieper says, one must love and will the good. And in the Christian view, that is the transformative work of the Holy Spirit, taking us from death to life. And I would just say right now, if you don't love and will the good, then you must immediately undertake a renewal of God's work in your life. I must immediately undertake a renewal of God's work in my life. That's a signpost of where we are in our relationship with God, because his primary work is to alter our intention toward the good, something that it's very difficult to do in a thorough way without the work of the Holy Spirit. So that's the basic starting point. We also grow in virtue through education, which includes contemplation, right? It includes thinking about what we've learned. And by naming and defining the virtues, we name and define our aim. We name and define what it is that we're aiming at. It's very hard to hit a target we don't have. And so, for example, when I examine the anxiety that haunts me before a lecture like this, I'm able to name my cowardice. And that is what it is. But it doesn't come with any berating of myself. But it's a kind of cowardice. And then I get to figure out what's going on. And then I say, pull yourself together and call up a little courage. Have a little courage. What is the wound that you will sustain? And maybe it's a serious one, but maybe it's not so bad. And maybe there are ways of mitigating that. And suddenly I find myself able to practice doing something which gives me the power for my life to flourish just a little bit more as I get to exercise my gifts and to think hard and to relate to you on a Tuesday afternoon like this. All of that is a process that strengthens and grows my courage, and it's education, naming and aiming, and then contemplating those things, self-reflecting, and finding myself growing in courage. An extension of education and contemplation is imitation. Noticing how others embody virtues and following that pattern, like a vine trained to a trellis. Lane Phillips is one of the people I pay attention to. How do you live? What a great thing to be able to imitate. That idea of knowing where one is going because you've looked at someone else and seen the direction to go. Is imitation a denunciation of our true selves? Do we create a false self by doing what someone else is doing? Well, I think the truth is we often really want things we don't know how to get. Imitation can be the result of a false self, but it can also be an expression of intent. And it's a form of learning and growth. And finally, the last condition for growth is practice. Simply trying over and over again. And this is where we must be reminded to drink deeply of grace and to emphasize again that virtue is not a moral target. It's more like the training of an athlete or a musician in which practice, growth, failure, persistence all move us towards more strength, better form, greater capacity. And it can all come within a context of expectation and joy for the direction we're taking instead of the overwhelming burden of feeling like we have failed. The middling painter should not berate herself because she's not yet Bruce Herman. The freshman violinist should not despair because he's not yet Sarita Kwok. Practice, man. Just practice. Because that's how we get better. That's how we get better at painting, and we get better musicianship, and it's also how we get better at virtue. We keep practicing because there's something really beautiful at the end, if there truly is an end, and a lot that's also really beautiful along the way. In doing all these things, we create the possibility for virtue to become what the ancients called our habitus, our very constitution, our full and natural way of being. And if that were true of all of us, if it was our full and natural way of being to embody the virtues, well, think of the flourishing. Think of the happiness. That's the end. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. It is 5:30, so that's the end. It is the end, just as I said. But I'm very happy to stay and talk, but I also want to respect your time and know some of you probably need to get going. So if you'd like to ask questions or raise some of your own points or thoughts, very much welcome those. But if you need to go, no offense taken. So for those of you who want to take this opportunity, please feel free to head out. Otherwise, I'd be happy to take questions if anyone has any.